Everybody, this is Dream, and today we have a nice 7-game college basketball slate. There's also the later slate, which has the last 3 games on it, so do keep that in mind. Both these slates a little bit harder than yesterday. We absolutely crushed yesterday, and hopefully we can do that again today. This slate is not nearly as good as that one, as it's got some more risk involved in this one. There's not as much value to choose from, and the best players are also more expensive. Plus, we have a couple 10,000 plus plays available on the slate, which definitely will make it more difficult to put good lineups together, especially when both those guys have some good potential today. So let's go ahead and get into the slate, though. Before I get started, can you guys smash that like and subscribe button? It really helps the channel a lot. I really do appreciate it, guys. Let's get into the injury report here real quick. We do have a couple guys for Indiana. We have Xavier Johnson is questionable, and this really could have a major impact on how DFS plays today. If he was to miss, we don't exactly know yet who would take his place in the lineup, but they play a very limited bench, so somebody there could potentially get a good big boost. And it does kind of look like he might be out today. Looking at Iowa State, Ward is out, who's played some games this season. And then if we look at DePaul, Terry is questionable. Now, he hasn't played yet this season, and it does look like he might end up drawing a play today, and that could inhibit a couple guys there. But overall, that game is mostly avoidable on the slate. Looking at UConn, Castle remains out, and he's missed several games in a row now, and so we're pretty used to him being out. But they do have a tough matchup against Kansas here. So as for the games themselves, they're all within a pretty same range. There's no game that's over double digit matchup except for the Iowa State DePaul game, and then most of the games are anywhere between 139 and 148 points. We have 3 ups tempo games with the St. John's, West Virginia, George Washington, South Carolina, and Kansas UConn. So obviously, the St. John's, South Carolina, and Kansas are teams, as well as UConn for that matter, are teams that we could consider stacking today. And as the other few games are a little bit more avoidable with their lower scores, and I even think that that a couple of those games lines are pretty high even for the two teams that are playing, because we have a pretty slow down game of Indiana and Maryland. We have a slower down game of Iowa State and DePaul, and even Purdue and Northwestern probably going to be a little bit lower than maybe the lines are showing at this point. So let's get into each individual game, and I'll talk about them. So we'll start with the Houston Xavier game. Now, Houston is favored to win this game by 7.5 points, and there's a 138-point total. I think the total is there simply because Houston's probably going to be able to score the points. But I don't think Xavier is going to have a very good chance here. This game should be a little bit lopsided, and that could be a difficult thing for fantasy. Houston's best win to this point of the season is Utah. They have a net of number 1 and an RPI of number 14. As for Xavier, their net is 18 and their RPI is 117. Their best win is against St. Mary, but they have a really bad loss against Oakland, and so that is a concern there. I think Houston will blow them out. So we do have one guy from this game from Houston that I like, and that's Jamal Sheed. He has played pretty solid so far this season. I think he has a pretty high floor for this game, regardless of what happens with whether it gets a blowout or not. And so I do like him here. LJ Cryer is a risky option as well, but he's a little bit too risky for this. But he is a kind of a GPP flyer if you want to take a flyer on him. And then for Xavier, there's a couple of guys that have some potential, and one of them being Desmond Claude, and the other one being Trey Green. But keep in mind that Trey Green does not play a ton of minutes usually, so he will come off the bench and probably play around 18 minutes. But he has played pretty well in those minutes when he has played. However, this matchup definitely makes it difficult. Then we're going to move it to the St. John's, West Virginia game here. Now, this game does feature some interesting high-scoring 147 total points, and it's a 4-point spread for St. John's. I do think this game is a little bit risky, as I think St. John's could actually blow this game out. And the reason I think that is because West Virginia, while they have several players that haven't even played yet this season, and they probably won't play today. There's a couple questionable tags, but they're waiting on NCAA approval, and they will not likely play today. And so they go with a very short amount of players. They only have really 6 guys that play any meaningful minutes. And as for St. John's, they also play a pretty small lineup. So I think you could literally run a St. John's, stack today with three or four of their guys, and you can kind of pick and choose. Soriano's probably the safest, and Jenkins is also a pretty good one. But um, on the other hand, it's also a game that you could choose to avoid because I think that total, while it is high, it probably is a little bit too high for this particular slate, especially with West Virginia being kind of incompetent as a team right now. If we look at St. John's, their net is 91 and RPI is 110. West Virginia's net is 24, but the RPI is 193. St. John's has beaten best win is North Texas and Utah, but they also lost to Dayton. As for West Virginia, the best win they've had is against Missouri State, but they also lost a bad game to Monmouth. So, I mean, both these teams are kind of up and down. Now, Rick Pitino tends to have a good defensive team, so West Virginia does seem pretty avoidable, despite the fact that they play a tight rotation. As for St. John's rotation, if you agree with me that you think that they might get a blowout here, then Soriano and Jenkins and even maybe Glenn Taylor have some potential, as well as Ledlam. I would stay away from Jordan Dingle as he's pretty much scoring dependent. But I really think that that's a pretty avoidable game generally, just because I think the scoring is a little bit lopsided, and if it stays close, it probably won't be a super high scoring game. Looking at the George Washington and South Carolina game, we definitely get an interesting matchup here. This game is in favor of South Carolina by about 10 points. It's at minus 9.5 right now with 149 point total. That total does feel a little high to me, as well as I don't think George Washington is going to be hanging with South Carolina, and they may even decide a really bad game. But there is a couple guys on their team that is definitely playing pretty well, so they definitely have some potential. And I do like some guys from South Carolina as well. Now, South Carolina has a 255 net, but a 45 RPI. Their best win right now is against Grand Canyon, so they haven't played a really tough schedule, and they're not rated very well. But they also lost to Virginia. They also beat Virginia Tech, which isn't the worst win in the world. Looking at George Washington, they have a minus 211 net and a 34 RPI. You can see both these teams are similar in that regard. But their best win is against Hofstra in Ohio, and then they lost to Illinois Chicago, which was a pretty bad loss for them. But we do have some guys in this game. If you think South Carolina is going to win the game, then I think both teams have a few players that, by 10 points or so. Then I think both teams have some players we can look at. The first being Mack here for South Carolina. Now, he's played pretty well. Now, he had a bad game against DePaul, but that was due to foul situation. And every other game this season, he's been pretty solid. His price is still okay here. It's a little higher than I'd like, but he does have a high ceiling, so that does give him some bonus. And so I do like him quite a bit here. Then we're going to look at Jacoby Wright. Now, he does come off the bench, so do keep that in mind, but he plays a pretty consistent amount of minutes, and he hasn't had a terrible game where he's been sub 11 fantasy points. And while and his prices come down a lot, which is definitely going to be helpful. He's a good way to kick in some value to help you pay up at other position. So for other players, as obviously we have to average $6,000, and there's not a whole lot of guys in that $5,000 range that really make it worthwhile today. So he's definitely a guy that I think should be somewhat popular with his consistent minutes and fantasy production so far, though he doesn't have the highest of ceilings, and so you're basically looking him to just a 4x to get you to other players. Looking at George Washington, now we do have, the South Carolina defense is rated pretty good, but you do have to keep in mind that they really haven't played anybody either, so that is part of that. But if you look at George Washington, they do have James Bishop, who's played very well so far this season. He has not really had a terrible game outside of the first game of the year, but that sometimes you try to figure out rotations early, and so right now it looks like he's probably their best player, and he's averaging 20 points a game, and he also gets assists and stuff, so he gets a little bit more things. He also gets some threes, but he's not hit more than two a game at least at this point, so he's a good play on this option, but he does have a slight scoring dependency. He's a little bit overpriced, but he's still viable here. Max Edwards is also in play for George Washington. I really actually kind of like him, as he has a pretty safe floor. And if you look through their games, even the games that they've lost, he's played pretty solid. In fact, he didn't have any bad game this season. So, and his minutes have been solid around 30 as well. And he's a little bit cheaper than Bishop, and he also averages 16 points and has 8 rebounds per game. And then he also hits a couple threes a game most of the time. Again, the defensive number here is probably a little bit not particularly perfect against South Carolina, because I don't think they're nearly as good as that defense suggests. And so I think that this should be a pretty back and forth game. And it should be it is the higher scoring game on the slate, and so it's definitely viable to use several players from this game. And then we're going to look at the Maryland and Indiana game. Now, this game has a lower floor, a lower price or total, excuse me, at 137 points. And it's a 3-point spread for Indiana. Now, having it being a 3-point spread actually gives some positive for utilizing players here because they're probably going to play more minutes. We do have an injury question here with Xavier Johnson for Indiana. If he doesn't play, that could potentially open up some options here. But overall, I just felt like everybody on this in this game is priced inconsistently. And for the record, it feels like most of the guys on these teams don't particularly do a lot of peripheral things, and these teams kind of stink. If we look at Indiana, they do have a 31 net and a 64 RPI, but their best win is against Wright State and Harvard. Their worst loss against UConn, so they did get a little bit difficulty against UConn in that game where they got blown out by 20 points. UConn is really good, so that is a thing, but they did manage to beat Louisville and stuff. But I really didn't think that they've done much so far this season to be super exciting. But I do like Renew. He has played very well, relatively consistent, and his price, while it has come up a little bit, he's still in play here as a decent option, especially considering that they're favored to win the game. But he does carry a little bit of risk because his floor is a little bit lower than some of the other guys in his price range. But he has just as good of a ceiling, and I don't think he has, in this particular matchup with the way that this game should play, he does have some potential here. I felt like Ware is a little bit overpriced, especially with other expensive options that have more potential. Then we look at Maryland. There's really not too much that I like here. Their net is 32 and their RPI is 239. Their best win is against South Alabama, but they also lost to Davidson. And as you can see, that the defensive numbers around these two teams are all over the place position-wise. So I think that it's really hard to gauge how that game is actually going to go. But I do think it's going to be a low-scoring game, and so it's pretty avoidable on the slate. Looking at Iowa State and DePaul, I really think this game total, the 139 points. I think that's probably a little bit high. This game is favored by 12.5 points in ISU's favor, and so that does give them a boost. ISU is remaining without Ward, and also DPU Terry is questionable. I don't think Terry's going to play today, but there's a potential that he does, and so he could impact a couple guys there, but I don't think it's going to be too much of a risk. If we look at ISU here, ISU is a 25 net and 175 RPI. Their best win is against VCU, and their worst loss against Virginia Tech. They're kind of a mid-average team right now. I think they're playing okay. My favorite play from this game is Lipsy. Now, he's a little bit pricey, but he's also got a really good ceiling, and he's played very solid so far this season. He had a little bit rougher game in one of their blowouts, but I don't think this game, while it is going to be a blowout, I don't think it's going to be such a blowout that he's going to play less minutes like he did in that one. But I think he'll get in the 34 to 44 range today, and that gives him a lot of potential. He's had a couple games where they won by a few points, and he managed to keep his fantasy production up. And so I do think he's a viable option on the slate, as he has a really good potential here, and his the defense here from DePaul is going to be lackluster at best. Looking at DePaul, there's really only one guy that's even reasonable at all, and that's Chico Carter. Now, he's actually been relatively consistent so far this season. He had one rough game against San Diego. I believe that's San Diego where he didn't do quite well, but he does tend to get some assists and rebounds, and then he also tends to get double-digit scoring. At least in most games, he has the potential, as he does take a pretty good amount of shots. I do like his potential here, and his price coming down a little bit does help, though he does have a lower floor than I'd like, so he does carry some risk, and so he's not a must-play by any stretch, but he is in that mid-level price range, which is a little bit better. However, he's kind of hard to roster on this particular slate, and he's definitely not somebody that I love, but in that late slate, you could definitely utilize him as a way to, pay a little bit less for somebody. Looking at the Kansas-UConn game, now this should be the premier matchup of the slate, as both these teams are very good. Now, with UConn, we do remember that Castle is still out, and he is one of their good players, but this should be a good game. I think that there's some defensive bonus for UConn, as they play very well, and they can have, as a upcoming blue blood, they're really playing well this season. Kansas is not playing bad either. If we look at Kansas, they have a 9 net and a 27 RPI. Their best wins are against Tennessee and Kentucky. Their worst loss right now is against Marquette. As for Connecticut, they have a 3 net with an 18 RPI, and their best win is against Texas. And they haven't lost yet. So both these teams are going to be coming in. This should be a tight game. It should be similar to for Kansas, it should be similar to the Kentucky and Tennessee games where they're kind of the back and forth affairs. Now, I don't know that Kansas will win this game, though. They are favored by 2 points. I think it could be a pretty, uh, you know, tight game here. But we do like a couple guys from this game. In fact, two guys on each team do pop out to me. One being McCullough for Kansas. And if we look at the Tennessee and the Kentucky game, he actually balled out in the Kentucky game. He didn't do quite as well in the Tennessee game, but his floor is still pretty good. If you ignore the fact that he only scored 22 fantasy points there, he had 7 turnovers in that game. I don't expect him to do that bad again here, and so I think he'll be a decent play. Though he's not a must play because he's a little bit overpriced, but I do like him here uh, decently, especially more for that later slate. Uh, I think he's a good play there. But I also really like Hunter Dickinson. Now, I mean, yeah, the defensive matchup metric here on DraftKings does say a pretty rough go. But if we look at the games that they played, um, I mean, he has not really had a bad game, terribly bad game. You could look at Marquette where he only scored 31 fantasy points. He only got 8 rebounds. I don't expect him to have trouble getting rebounds today as much, but getting the scoring is going to be the bigger issue here. But he should be fine even at this price point. He's my favorite play of the 10K plus guys, and so I do think he's a viable option on here. I think he will score over 50 fantasy points and get a big double double. As for UConn, it gets a little bit tougher here, but Ball for them does start, and he's been relatively consistent. He does have a low floor, but um, he's not going to score 25 fantasy points probably, but he's been getting 10 to 15 fantasy points in most games, and at his near minimum price point, that is actually a viable option here on this particular slate because we have such uh, consistency with expensive guys in the $7,000 range, and we need some cheap options. And if you were to pay up for one of the more expensive plays, then you would need somebody like him to kind of offset that, and he can definitely fit that bill, though he does carry a lot of risk. Looking at Cam Spencer, he is also a very good play on the slate. He's been solid all season long, and if you just wipe out that first game of the year, he's been pretty consistent. He has typically been decent with the other stats, but he's not a huge assist and rebound guy, but he's managing 6 per game between the two total, and so I do think he's some viability there. He also has 3 threes per game on average so far this season. And you could obviously stack either one of these teams if you think that they're going to have some boostability in that perspective. But for the late slate, it's definitely a game to target, as it's definitely going to be the game that scores the most points in that late slate. You could stack both teams to some extent and get some value around that. Looking at the Purdue Northwestern game, this game also has some guys that I like. Now it's a riskier game, as I think this is going to be lower scoring than the 138 points total that it suggests. It is an 8-point favorite for Purdue. Now Purdue has a number 6 net and a number 1 RPI. They're a very good team so far this season. They beat Tennessee, Marquette, and Gonzaga already. I don't think they'll have too much problem with Northwestern, who has a 37 net and a 9 RPI. Their best wins are against Dayton, and their worst loss against Mississippi State. So it's not a bad loss, but they just haven't played as tough a schedule as Purdue has, and Purdue is legitimately a good team. For Purdue, my favorite play here is Braden Smith. He's played very solid so far this season. He has a high ceiling. Even in the tougher games, he's done pretty good, though in the Tennessee game, he was probably his worst, but I still expect them to win this game handily, and Northwestern isn't Tennessee, so he'll do have one of his more normal games. He's actually my favorite play, I think, on the slate in general, as he's played very well so far this season, and I like his potential here. Obviously, Zach Edey is in play, but he does carry some risk, as he's $1,000 more expensive than Kansas Hunter Dickinson, and I think Hunter Dickinson has been safer so far this season, and I think that he's probably slightly better than him. As for Northwestern, Ty Berry is in play, and he's actually one of the few guys in this $5,000 point range that I like. He's been pretty solid so far this season. Now, his role has really increased the last 3 games, and if that continues, then he has some potential here. He's even been okay with the game that he lost against Mississippi State. He scored 26 fantasy points, and we're looking for a 25 fantasy point game from him today on DraftKings for this price point. So he's definitely viable here, though. Just keep in mind Purdue could get this game out of hand, and that could hurt his potential here, as he does tend to be somewhat scoring dependent. So he's not a great play, but he is a viable option, especially in that later slate. He has some more potential there. So with that said, guys, thank you for liking, commenting, and subscribing. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to leave them below, and have a nice day, guys.